The base is going to be 34 inches tall. So I'm going to cut these in half so that I have a couple of 36-inch pieces that'll just be easier to deal with and run through the planer. This project really came about as a way to gear myself up to get back into some woodworking. If you've been following along on our channel, you know it's been months of really robust home improvement projects and DIY builds, which calls for a different set of skills and way of working. I have a long list of furniture I want to try to make for the house, but since I've been away from furniture making for many months now, I wanted to tackle something small and simple just to get back into the groove of woodworking. So I'm going to be making a pedestal accent table to use as a plant stand. A really simple, tall stand to hold one singular vase. I think it will make a nice subtle statement in a specific corner of our house. Since it will be used to hold a vase, flowers, nature, and, well, vases were my inspiration for the design. I want the stand to echo the shape of a traditional vase, having a nice soft curve that starts sort of bulbous on the bottom and tapers into a much thinner and more delicate top. It should sort of resemble the shape of a budding flower. In order to create that sort of a silhouette without it being a solid sculpted piece of wood, I'm going to be creating a sort of plus sign that will look like two intersecting planes built by creating one large panel that two smaller panels will get attached to on either side. I'm going to be using solid red oak to make this. It's a fairly inexpensive hardwood with a nice strong grain pattern that should help add a sort of nostalgic warmth to the finished look. I did buy boards that were surfaced on both sides, but once I brought them home I realized they weren't exactly flat and would still require some milling. Since I don't have a jointer which would easily flatten the board for me, I used a technique I learned from fellow YouTubers to flatten one face of the board by building a plywood sled and shimming the gaps in the board before running it through the planer. The planer scrapes off the top layer of wood to give you a clean surface, but it will follow whatever curve or bend is naturally in the board, so by mounting it to a truly flat base and shimming the gaps, the planer will follow the flatness of the plywood underneath and scrape off the high points in the board, leaving you with one truly flat face. Once one side is flattened, you remove the board from the sled, flip it over, and flatten the other side. I'll leave a link to the Jonathan Katz Moses video that I followed so you can do some more research if you're interested in doing this yourself. In order to match the shape on all sides of the table, I made a template out of some scrap MDF. I just drew a curve freehand, cut it out with a jigsaw, and sanded it nice and smooth. This will be what I use to create the overall silhouette of the base. I started by tracing the shape on all four sides. Then I used my track saw to cut out the part of the silhouette that is more of a straight line, and a jigsaw to cut out the curves at the bottom of the base. I really hate using the jigsaw for stuff like this. It's most certainly a user error, but I can never manage to get a nice clean cut with it. One day I hope to add a bandsaw to my collection of tools that will really make cutting shapes like this much easier, but luckily these are just rough cuts. I'm going to be refining the shape with my template in the next step. To attach the template to my workpiece, I used this double-sided tape I bought a few years back. This stuff is really strong and has been the perfect solution to mounting templates for me. I'll leave a link in the description along with some other materials I used if you're interested in checking it out. Then I used my flush trim router bit to... So a few words of caution in the hopes that you might learn from my mistakes. 1. Don't wear gloves when using the router table or any tool with a rotating blade. It's dangerous. 2. Be careful when routing around curves. This is a more difficult cut than I realized because I was transitioning from cutting along the grain to cutting end grain as I made the turn. The blades on the router bit ripped apart the wood at the end grain, causing that nasty kickback. Accidents like this are minor, but good warnings. It definitely instilled a healthy amount of fear in me moving forward. So after some research that I should have done 2 years ago when I first started using this router table, I decided to upgrade my bit. This monster bit is by a company called Infinity Tools. It has both upward and downward cutting blades. Cutting in both directions like this should minimize the risk of kickbacks. It also has a bearing on the top and bottom, which means you can mount your template either to the bottom or top of your workpiece, which allows you to follow the grain direction as needed. And it's just far beefier and is able to rip through dense hardwood like butter. I actually didn't need a diameter this wide, but the more narrow bit wasn't available at the time of purchase, so I had to go for this mega bit. But I have zero regrets so far. To fix my mistake, I decided to use this epoxy putty. It's moldable and takes a little while to dry, which means I should have ample time to work with it. I just used this stuff to mend the ends of our decaying rafter tails around the house, and it worked amazingly well. I was happy to find it also did the job here, and I was able to sand it nice and smooth and even run it through the router without a problem. If wood wasn't so expensive, I might have just started over with this part of the build, but there is something satisfying about making it work with what you have and finding solutions to your problems with the materials at your disposal. Using the new router bit was like night and day. It cuts like butter and helped me regain my confidence at the router table. With all the parts for the base finally cut, I was ready to start planning the assembly. I'm going to be attaching the smaller panels to the larger one with a loose tenon joint using my domino tool, so I began by marking the center on the face of the larger panel and the center on the edge of the smaller panel so I can ensure the intersection of the two pieces are centered. Then I just clamped the small panel onto the face of the larger panel, lining up the edge of the small panel with my mark of where it should land on the larger panel. Okay, so I made a mark on the top, and that should be all I need because when I slide this down, the screen here has markings I can follow. So if I follow the top mark, I can line it up to get the mortise in the side panel, and then I flip this over and come in on the face panel, and there's tiny grooves in the domino tool here, so I can use the center line to line up with my line on the side panel and make sure the mortises are going to land right in the same spot on either board. This butt joint in the middle of a panel is the kind of thing you do when connecting a shelf to a cabinet side. It can be a little tricky to wrap your head around, but if you mark and lay out the two pieces properly, the top panel should swing into place and its mortises should land perfectly in line with the mortises on the bottom panel. In order to soften the profile of this piece, which feels more in keeping with my design inspiration, I wanted to round over the edges, but I waited until after my mortises were in place and everything was dry fitted before doing this. Unfortunately, I underestimated how tricky of a glue-up this was going to be. The organic shape of the base complicates clamping, and my clamps are just not deep enough to reach past the middle panel and around the piece. So I tried using some tie-down straps, but I couldn't get enough force to cinch everything together. In a moment of panic as the glue was quickly drying, I enlisted Aaron's help to pry it apart and wipe up the glue so I could regroup and start over. Luckily, we were able to take it apart without too much difficulty or damage, and I had to go ahead and buy new clamps that have a deeper throat. But the next challenge was dealing with the fully rounded edges of the piece. The feet of the clamps had nothing flat to rest on, making them slide off the workpiece as I tightened, so I quickly threw together little blocks to provide the clamps with a flat surface to hold onto. In the end, it was a jumbled up mess of clamps and blocks. It may not look pretty, but it did the job. Hopefully in the future, I'll think more about clamping before I start to lay down the glue. After such a frustrating assembly, it was really satisfying to see the piece start to take shape. All that's left now is the top. I took what was left of my red oak and glued up a panel. Unfortunately, the last bit of wood I had was badly warped, so I lost a lot of thickness planing it flat, which means the top is going to be thinner than I had hoped, but I figured I'd make it work. I made a simple circle template, again out of some scrap MDF. First, I determined what I wanted the radius of my circle to be and used that measurement to draw 2 points onto this scrap board that I'm drilling into. That board gets mounted to what will be the center of my circle template, and then I drilled a hole through the other mark on the board wide enough to just fit the tip of my pencil through. You can also do this with a piece of string attached to a screw. The idea is just to maintain the same radius as you rotate to create a perfect circle of any size. Once my panel was dry, I transferred the circle to it and roughly cut it out with a jigsaw and some sanding. Then it was time to take it to the router table to try out my new bit again. I was so happy with the result. It was super easy and safe, and I ended up with a beautiful circle top. Unfortunately, the top is too thin to use dominoes to attach it to the base, and my patience at this point has also grown thin, so I decided to just screw it together, countersinking the holes so I can fill them in later. It's not the most elegant solution, but I think I convinced myself it was good enough at the time because the top will be mostly covered by whatever plant I put on it. Looking back at it now, I do regret not coming up with a more hidden solution, but lesson learned. I decided to stain the table with the General Finishes stain in a color called Antique Oak. I started by sanding everything smooth, but since I'm going to be using a water-based stain, I went ahead and wet the table with a damp cloth to raise the grain. Then I lightly sanded again to knock off the raised grain before staining. If I had skipped this step, the water-based stain would likely cause some of the grain to rise, and I'd lose that smooth-to-the-touch finish I was after. By wetting it first, the stain didn't add any unwanted bumpiness once applied. I know this honey-colored wood is not for everyone, but for this project I really like the look of a warmer toned wood. I find myself really drawn to the mix of old and new in just about everything I design, whether it's a room or a piece of furniture, and I feel like the design of this table feels really modern and clean, but I knew I wanted to infuse a bit of old into it in some way. It's one of the reasons I chose the red oak. Tinted in this warm stain, the pronounced grain pattern of the wood feels like something from another era. Combining a modern shape with a more classic and traditional grain and color, I think adds some interest to the piece. To finish it off, I went with this Osmo hard wax. I love this stuff, and I've been using it on just about everything lately. It's an oil-based top coat, so I did go ahead and wait a full week before sealing the table since my stain was water-based, just to ensure the wood was fully dry before applying. It wipes on and off really easily, and the clear satin finish I used left just the perfect amount of subtle sheen once it dried. I wanted it to look almost matte with only the tiniest hint of sheen because I think going too glossy would have pushed me too far into grandma's furniture territory. Let me know what you think and if you would have done anything differently in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.